He thought he was putting an old man in his place. He thought he was drawing a line in the sand on Thanksgiving Day, in front of my grandchildren, in the house I had paid for with 31 years of work. He was wrong about almost everything. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I buried my wife 4 years ago, and I have spent every day since then trying to be useful to the people I love. I thought that was enough. I thought love worked that way, that if you gave it consistently and quietly, it would be returned the same way. My son-in-law taught me otherwise. His name is Derek. My daughter met him at a company event 7 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, loud at dinner parties, good at remembering names, quick with a joke. My wife liked him immediately. I was slower to come around, but I told myself that was just the nature of fathers and the men who marry their daughters. I told myself I was being protective for no reason. I was wrong about that too. When my wife passed, my daughter moved back to Seattle with Derek and their 2 kids. My grandson was 6 then. My granddaughter was 4. The house they moved into was the house I had owned outright since 2019, a 4-bedroom craftsman, in a neighborhood I had watched grow up around it for 20 years. I told my daughter she could live there rent-free. I told her I would cover the property taxes and the utilities while she got back on her feet, because she had taken time away from her career to raise the children, and I did not want her to feel the pressure of a lease on top of grief. She cried when I told her. Derek shook my hand and said I was one of a kind. That lasted about 2 years. I should have noticed the shift earlier. The invitations to Sunday dinners started coming less frequently. When I did come over, Derek had a habit of making small comments, nothing you could call him out on directly, nothing that would survive being repeated to someone else, but comments that accumulated over time like water damage behind a wall, comments about how I told the same stories, comments about how I hovered. Once, when I picked up my granddaughter from school because my daughter had asked me to, Derek came home and walked into the kitchen where I was making her a snack and said, very calmly, that he would appreciate if I called ahead next time, instead of just letting myself into his house. I put down the bread knife and looked at him for a moment. Then I said, of course. I drove home and I did not say anything to my daughter about it. What I should have done at that point is what I eventually did much later. But I was afraid of losing access to my grandchildren. That fear is the thing Derek understood and used better than anything else. The business started in the spring of the year before last. Derek came to me with a plan, a home renovation company he wanted to launch with a friend of his. He had put together a presentation, actual slides on his laptop, numbers and projections, and a market analysis for the Seattle area. I sat across from him at my own kitchen table and I listened for 45 minutes. When he was done, he asked me to co-sign a business loan, $400,000. He said the bank needed a co-signer because his credit history had some complications from a partnership that had gone sideways in his late 20s. Nothing serious, just a technical issue. My daughter sat next to him and she looked at me with eyes that reminded me of her mother. I signed. I want to be clear about something. I am not a wealthy man in the way people mean when they say that in movies. I am comfortable. I have a pension from the engineering firm where I worked for 3 decades. I have investments I made carefully over many years, starting when my wife and I were young and could barely afford the minimums. I own the house in the Craftsman neighborhood, and I own a small rental property on the east side of the city that I have been managing since 2011. I am not hiding millions. I am an ordinary man who worked hard and made reasonable decisions and ended up at 63 in a position of modest security. But Derek did not know the details of any of that. He knew what I let him see, which was a retired man on a fixed income who owned 1 house and drove a 7-year-old Honda. The renovation business struggled from the start. Derek called me twice in the first 6 months asking for cash advances against the loan guarantee, which is not how loan guarantees work, and I had to explain that to him both times. He took the explanations poorly. By summer, he had stopped calling me altogether, and I was getting most of my information about my own daughter's life through texts that felt increasingly like corporate communications. Brief, polite in a way that is actually a form of coldness. Thanksgiving came. My daughter had called 2 weeks earlier to invite me. She said Derek was going to smoke a turkey this year, and that the kids were excited to see me. I bought my grandson a book he had mentioned wanting, and I found a bracelet-making kit for my granddaughter because she had gone through a phase of making everyone in the family bracelets out of thread. I drove over on Thanksgiving morning with a pecan pie from the bakery my wife and I used to go to every holiday season. The one on Eastlake that still uses her recipe for the crust. The morning was fine. My grandchildren ran to the door when I knocked. My grandson showed me a model airplane he had built. My granddaughter immediately began trying to make me a bracelet out of orange and brown thread because, she explained very seriously, those were Thanksgiving colors. I sat on the living room floor with her and held the threads where she needed me to hold them, and I thought for a while that I had been wrong to worry about anything. Derek came inside around 11 from the backyard, where he had been managing the smoker. He poured himself a beer and sat at the kitchen island and started going through his phone. My daughter was moving between the kitchen and the dining room, setting things out. I offered to help. She gave me the job of arranging the serving dishes and telling her if the table looked balanced, which was a kind and gentle way of keeping me involved without requiring Derek to speak to me. Lunch was good. The turkey was genuinely excellent, and I told Derek that honestly. He nodded without looking up from his plate. My granddaughter gave a small speech before we ate that she had clearly rehearsed, about being thankful for her family and her cat and her teacher and her new bracelet-making kit. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. It was after lunch, while my daughter was putting the children down for a rest and Derek and I were alone in the kitchen with the dishes, that it happened. He started by asking how I had been spending my time. I told him about a book I had been reading on Pacific Northwest architecture and about the walks I had been taking along the waterfront. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he said, without any particular escalation, that he and my daughter had been talking and they thought it might be time for me to start thinking about my own situation. I asked him what he meant by my situation. He put down the dish towel and leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. He said that my daughter worried about me rattling around in a big house by myself. He said that a man my age should probably be thinking about downsizing, about senior communities, about what happened if my health changed. He said it in a reasonable voice, the kind of voice people use when they have rehearsed what they are about to say and have decided to frame something aggressive as concern. I said I appreciated him sharing that. He said there was something else. He said that he and my daughter had been carrying a lot of financial stress since the business had not grown as projected, and that having the house be a rental rather than an owner-occupied property had certain tax implications that were making their situation more complicated. He said that my daughter, as the person I would presumably be passing the house to eventually, had an interest in how the property was being managed. He said that if I were to transition into a senior living arrangement, it would make sense for them to take over ownership now rather than later, and that they had spoken to a real estate attorney about the process. I stood very still. He said that he knew it was a lot to think about on a holiday, and that nobody was pressuring me, but that it would be helpful to have a conversation about a timeline in the new year. I asked him to be direct with me. He said, with the same measured tone, that they needed the house. That between the business and the mortgage on a second property they had been trying to purchase, the financial picture required them to consolidate. That my living independently in a house that size was, from a practical standpoint, difficult to justify. I asked what would happen if I declined to discuss it. He looked at me for the first time in the conversation with something other than performed patience. He said that my continued presence in their lives, as much as everyone valued it, needed to be something that worked for the whole family. He said that the loan situation created complications that made a clean arrangement preferable to an ambiguous one. He was using the loan as leverage. He said it with enough plausible deniability that you could not point to the exact sentence where the threat was made, but there was no other way to read it. If I did not cooperate, my access to my grandchildren would become, as he had put it, complicated. I put my coat on. I said I needed some air and I would be back to say goodbye to the children. I walked out to my car and I sat in the driver's seat in the cold Seattle afternoon and I looked at the steering wheel for about 10 minutes. Then I made a phone call. His name is Arthur, and he has been my attorney, and more importantly, my friend since 1997. I called him on Thanksgiving because I knew he would pick up and because there was no one else I needed to talk to in that moment. I told him what had happened, quickly, without emotion. Arthur listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, very quietly, that I should not give Derek or my daughter any indication of what I was thinking, that I should go back inside, say goodbye to the children normally, and call him Friday morning. I went back inside. My granddaughter ran to me with the finished bracelet, orange and brown thread, and tied it around my wrist herself with her small, serious hands. I kissed the top of her head. I hugged my grandson. I found my daughter in the kitchen and I told her lunch was wonderful and I would call her soon. I did not say anything to Derek. I drove home. Friday morning I was at Arthur's home office by 9. Here is what I needed Arthur to help me understand, because my knowledge of property law is not thorough. When I had made my daughter a resident of the Craftsman House, I had done so as a licensee, not as a tenant with legal rights. I had never signed a lease. There was no rental agreement. The property was and had always been solely in my name. I had covered the taxes and utilities from my own accounts, which Arthur confirmed I could document clearly. Derek's name appeared nowhere on the property. The business loan was different. I had co-signed, which meant I was a guarantor. If Derek defaulted, the liability was mine. Arthur pulled up the loan documents and we went through them together. The loan was secured against the business assets, not against my personal property. My exposure was real but limited. And Arthur had noticed something Derek's attorney apparently had not emphasized clearly enough. The loan agreement had a clause that allowed the guarantor to petition for release from the guarantee if the primary borrower could be demonstrated to have assets sufficient to cover the Brockham obligation. Derek's house, not my Craftsman, but a second property he and my daughter had been in the process of purchasing, had closed escrow in October. It had equity. Arthur said the process would take time, but it was available to me. I told Arthur what I wanted to do. He looked at me over his glasses for a moment and then he said, "All right, let's be methodical about this." The first thing I did was nothing. For 2 weeks I did absolutely nothing different. I did not call my daughter. I did not respond to Derek's follow-up text, sent the Monday after Thanksgiving, which said simply that he hoped I had had time to reflect and that he was available to talk when I was ready. I did not respond because Arthur had told me that any written communication from me at this stage could be used to characterize my eventual actions as retaliatory rather than simply the exercise of my legal rights. The second thing I did was talk to my accountant, a woman named Patricia, who has managed my finances for 15 years, and who, when I explained the situation, they was quiet for a moment, and then said she had always found Derek difficult to read. I authorized Patricia to begin the process of transferring the utilities on the Craftsman House back into my name from my daughter's. The gas, the electric, the water, the internet, all of it. My daughter had never been billed for any of it. I had simply arranged for the accounts to reflect the address and had paid them directly. Changing the billing arrangements back to my management was, as Patricia confirmed, entirely within my rights. I set a date for the transfers. The third thing I did was call the bank that held the business loan. I did not do anything dramatic. I simply introduced myself as the guarantor on the account, confirmed my information, and asked to be added to the notification list for any communications regarding the account status. The representative confirmed this was standard for guarantors and added my email. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called a property management company I had worked with before regarding my rental on the east side. I told them I had a Craftsman property that I would need professionally managed beginning in the new year, and I asked them to send me their standard agreement. I need to tell you about what happened in December, because it is the part that was hardest, and also the part I think about most often now. My daughter called me on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of December. She asked if I could come over. I said I was available the following Tuesday. She said she had been thinking about our family and that she missed talking to me the way we used to talk. I said I missed that too, and I meant it. When I arrived on Tuesday, Derek was not home. My grandchildren were at school. My daughter made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed the loan documents, and she told me she was sorry. She did not say specifically what she was sorry for. She said that Derek was under a lot of pressure, and that she knew Thanksgiving had not gone well. She said she wanted us to find a way forward that worked for everyone. I looked at my daughter, her mother's eyes, her mother's way of holding her coffee cup with both hands, and I told her I loved her without condition. I told her that nothing about what I was about to do was intended to hurt her or the children. I told her that I needed her to understand something important, which was that I was her father and not Derek's resource, and that I had spent 4 years since her mother died trying to hold everything together for everyone, and I was going to stop doing that now. Not out of anger, but because it had not been working for any of us. She asked me what I meant by what I was about to do. I told her that I would be resuming management of the Craftsman property directly and that she would begin receiving correspondence from my property management company in January. I told her that I had spoken to Arthur about the loan guarantee situation and that there was a legal path toward restructuring my exposure there that I intended to pursue. I told her that none of this changed my relationship with her children, that I would be at every school event and every birthday and every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that she would allow me, and that I had already set up a small educational trust for both grandchildren, that Derek's name was nowhere near. She was crying by the time I finished. I did not try to stop her or tell her it was all right. I sat with her until she was done. She asked me if there was anything she could say to change my mind. I told her that if she and Derek wanted to stay in the house as tenants at a fair market rate, I was open to that conversation, and Arthur could facilitate it. I told her that if Derek wanted to discuss a restructuring of his loan guarantee with the bank directly and could demonstrate the business had viable assets, I would not oppose that process. I told her the door was not closed on any reasonable arrangement. What the door was closed on, I said, was being managed, being leveraged, being made to feel that my access to my grandchildren was a privilege Derek administered. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, quietly, that she had known for over a year that something about this wasn't right and that she had told herself it was just stress. I told her I believed her. We sat there for a while longer, and then I drove home. Derek did not take it well. Arthur received a letter in late December from a lawyer Derek had retained, making various claims about my obligations as a cosigner and implying that my actions regarding the utilities constituted some form of constructive interference with their residents. Arthur wrote a very precise response that went through each claim and explained, with documented evidence, why none of them had legal merit. He attached a copy of the property deed, the utility account history, and the guarantor clause of the loan agreement. He noted, at the end of the letter, that my client retained all rights as the sole owner of the property and would be happy to discuss a formal lease arrangement at market rate. We did not hear back from Derek's lawyer. The property management company sent their formal notice in January. The utilities transitioned back to my accounts the same week. My daughter called me when the letters arrived, and she sounded frightened in the way that people sound when a reality they have been avoiding finally becomes paperwork. I told her I was not trying to rush anything. I told her the children could stay in their schools and their rooms, and she had time to make decisions thoughtfully. I told her I would not do anything that disrupted the children's lives without giving her adequate notice. She asked me where I was going to live. I told her about the rental property on the east side. My tenant's lease had ended in November, and I had quietly renovated the unit over the winter, new kitchen counters, refinished floors, a proper home office. It was smaller than the Craftsman, but it had a view of the water and a garden that I had been looking forward to working on for years. I had moved in 2 weeks earlier. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, you have a plan for everything, don't you?" I told her her mother always said the same thing. What I want to tell you about the end of this is not dramatic. There was no confrontation at a courthouse, no sheriff arriving with papers while Derek stood on the lawn. What happened was slower and, I think, more honest than that. Derek and my daughter sat with the reality of the situation through the winter. In March, Derek's business partner bought him out of the renovation company for a sum that, while modest, was enough to demonstrate to the bank that the business had liquidatable assets, which allowed Arthur to begin the process of removing me as guarantor. My daughter began working again, part-time at first, then full-time by summer. She and Derek listed the Craftsman on the market in April. I did not need to ask them to leave. They left because the math finally told them what I had stopped saying out loud. My daughter brought the children to my place on the east side for dinner on a Sunday in May. My grandson asked about the model ships I had started building in the home office. My granddaughter arrived with new thread, purple and gold, and informed me that she was upgrading my bracelet. I held the threads where she told me to hold them. Derek came too. He sat across from me at my small kitchen table, and he was quieter than I had ever seen him. Not humble exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular quiet of a man who has run out of angles. I poured him coffee, and I did not say anything about any of it. That is not generosity on my part. It is just that there was nothing left to say. My daughter helped me clear the dishes after dinner. She stood at my sink the way she used to stand at her mother's sink, not really washing anything, just holding a towel and looking out the window. She said she was sorry, for real this time. Specifically, she listed the things she was sorry for, and I listened to all of them. I told her she was a good mother. I told her I had watched her with those children all year, and she was a genuinely good mother, and that her mother would have said the same thing. She put down the dish towel and hugged me the way she used to hug me when she was young, both arms tight, her face against my shoulder. I stood there in my kitchen in the last of the Sunday evening light, and I held on. There is a version of this story where I am the hero because I won. I don't think that's the right version. The right version, the one I think about when I'm working in the garden or finishing a model ship at my desk late at night, is simpler than that. I spent 4 years after losing my wife, giving everything I had to hold a life together that was not entirely mine to hold. I did it out of love, and I did it out of fear, and I did it because it was easier than facing the empty house. And when someone I had let get too close tried to use that against me, I had to decide what I was actually willing to lose. I was not willing to lose my dignity. I was not willing to lose my grandchildren. Everything else, I found out, I could let go of more easily than I had expected. The bracelet is still on my wrist. Orange and brown, slightly faded now. I have worn it every day since Thanksgiving. I don't plan to take it off.